Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our lunch bite session of the conference called Patient Engagement in Clinical Trials. And I'm very excited to have a panel here today to discuss this topic. And our facilitator, I would like to introduce Larry Morose from the BC Support Unit, and he is the Research Services lead there. Hi, Larry.
Hi, Allison. Thanks for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel discussion. And we're going to be talking about patient engagement in clinical trials. And when we say the word patient, I don't want us to be stuck on the word patient. It's public, partners, community members. But I'd like to start by introducing all our panelists. So I'll start off with Heidi Scott, who is a patient partner. Heidi, welcome.
Hi, so I'm Heidi Scott. I live on a farm in rural BC, Fruitvale to be specific, which is in the West Kootenays, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, welcome. Thank you, Heidi. And next I'd like to introduce Melanie Reed, another patient partner who's joined us today.
Hi, I'm pleased to be here. I'm Melanie Reed, and I'm a patient partner in the middle of Vancouver, British Columbia.
Wonderful. And I'd just like to say that when doing patient engagement, we really do want to engage patient partners in every step of the process. So Heidi and Melanie were both instrumental in building this panel today and creating this. So thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce our clinical investigator, Srin Murthy.
Hi, everyone. Also from Vancouver. It's a pleasure to be here.
Welcome, Srin. And then Bev Pomeroy from the BC Support Unit in Fraser.
Hey everybody, I'm the patient engagement specialist out here at Fraser Health for the Department of Evaluation and Research Services. So thank you guys for having me.
Thank you, Bev. And then Allison, our Director of Clinical Trials BC.
Thanks, Larry. Hi, everyone. And I'm coming to you for today from South Surrey White Rock in British Columbia.
Great. Well, welcome, panelists. The intent of today is to talk a little bit about patient engagement in clinical trials in an informal way. So this is more of a casual conversation that I'll be sort of asking a few questions, and hopefully we'll be exploring some of the topics that are really important and interesting to doing clinical trials today. So let's start off by talking to the patient partners. I'd really like to know, let's start with Heidi, sort of what got you started, what got you involved in clinical trials in the first place?
So to begin with, I'm interested in science and research. And then I became a participant in a clinical trial. And as a remote participant, that posed a lot of extra challenges. But what really inspired me to kind of get involved to make the system better was that my clinical trial came to, for me, a very unpleasant end. I knew that communication had broken down between UBC and to the drug company around moving to the open label phase of the trial. But I still thought I had 4 months left in the trial, and I was given 1 week's notice and told it was over. In reality, did it make any difference to my care? Probably not, but I can't overstate the emotional burden that had on me. And throughout the trial, I also felt like the UBC was kind of hamstrung in what information they were allowed to give me. I felt like I, as a patient, was a lab rat to the drug company, and I don't want other patients to feel like that. So that's why I got involved.
Great, thanks, Heidi. And so what got you involved with Clinical Trials BC, and what did you hope to do getting involved with this organization?
So specifically, an opportunity arose to participate in a working group to get results to patients, because that is one of the big problems. Many of us go through these trials and we never hear about the outcome of them. You know, I can go to clinicaltrials.gov, but the information is not accessible. And so it's really important that we start getting results presented to patients in a way that we can actually make use of them and feel like we contributed to society. That's the reason we participate in these trials in the first place.
Well, that's great. So there's really something that drove you, that brought you to getting involved in clinical trials, and that's kind of helped direct you in what you're doing here.
That's right. And I've really appreciated clinical trials. This group has been like I feel like I'm a real part of it and that I have the potential to make a difference to other patients, and that's why we do it.
Wonderful. How about Melanie? What brought you to getting involved with Clinical Trials BC?
I had a sudden reaction to a drug years ago, the standard antibiotic, and I ended up in a hospital and with a transplant. While I was hospitalized, I was asked to join a trial looking for markers of transplant rejection. And throughout my visit there, I gave blood samples and every kind of sample anyway, so they just went into the database. As I've progressed, that was 12 years ago, every time I shift immunosuppressions, more samples are taken and generally recorded. So that's kind of started me off. I think my motivation was just, it was a fairly awful experience, and anything I could do to stop somebody else from having an experience like that. I was also interested in how immunosuppression worked. I'd never thought about it. I'd been healthy all my life until that point. And so I started to learn little bits about all the things that could go wrong with B cells, T cells, and various sorts of cells. Became interested. That went on for years. A few years after that, my husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and he immediately became involved in trials with the Center for Brain Health at UBC. And I was always either his support person or one of the control group, which kind of surprised me. So we've done a variety of things with medical devices, and we've had varying experience. One was really awful, where we were given directions to go to a site, and we were in the middle of a parking lot wandering around trying to figure out where the hell to go. We went into a new building, parts of it were blocked off. The elevator took us into a pharmacy that seemed to be in the middle of nowhere. We went up to the floor finally where the lab was, and all the doors were locked and nobody was inside. So we had those kinds of experiences. My husband's involvement showed me how important it was for clinical trials to consider the patient population they're dealing with. With his Parkinson's in particular, he needs breaks, he needs food, he needs water, he needs access to a washroom fairly quickly. And in one of the trials he was in, none of that was provided. It seemed like a very unsafe environment. In another one at UBC, done on campus, it was great. There was a nurse with him all the time. If I wasn't there, she stayed with him. He was escorted home if I was unable to pick him up. So just seeing the difference of the way trials are run, and one that seems successful for a patient and one that seems a disaster for a patient participant. I'm interested in doing anything I can to help the research. I believe the research and the treatment of the conditions is so closely related that anything anyone can do to help that along should be done.
Absolutely great, thank you. And of course, that the whole idea that we really need to hear from the population that's being studied in the projects. That's the key point of patient engagement and patient-oriented research. So let's move on to Srin, if you're up to answering this question. I'd like to know what got you involved in engaging patient partners in your research.
I think as someone who does the research, you have to think as to how you want your research to be effective, namely you can get the research done, and then B, people use the research for the things that you want them to use it for. And if the goal of research more broadly is to make patients better and make the public better, like having both A and B, as mentioned before, be thought about and engaged by with patients, like it's intuitive. Like I don't know how we would think about it without that framework in place. Obviously, there's challenges along the lines there, and I'm sure we'll get at some of those challenges to make sure that that engagement is meaningful and effective at getting the goals that you want, namely the research being used and patients getting better. And that is what we'll probably talk about over these next few minutes, I'm sure.
Well, great. Thanks, Ren. Can I ask you if you can share with us any experiences with engaging patients in your research?
Yeah, of course. And so I've done a few clinical trials where at the time where you're even thinking about running the clinical trial, you ask a few patients, and we've had partners and panels that have helped inform some of the questions asked, the outcomes measured, how you are going to approach patients, and so on. And that's been successful and sort of has led to the project being modified and implemented in a robust way. I've also done projects where I've engaged patients after the protocol has been written and after sort of things are going, and I sort of like ask the patients, is this all right? Is this like what I'm doing now? Is this like okay? And that has been, from an engagement perspective, obviously less successful. The challenge is like trying to remember and trying to do the former when the latter is like the lowest hanging fruit, you could say. If you want to get a project started quickly, you can just do a project, write the protocol, and off you go. If you want to do it right, it takes longer. And building in a system whereby we can do the right way, the easy way, is, I guess, why we're here, to sort of help build that process and framework.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ren. So let's move on to Bev. Bev, in your experience working in research in Fraser Health, how do you see patient engagement working in your work?
Thanks, Larry, for that. And it's so interesting hearing everybody else's sort of perspective and lens. This panel is really great. So my role is patient engagement in the Department of Evaluation and Research Services, which I think I'm one of the few in the province who's doing that full time for anywhere, never mind a health authority. So I basically live, eat, breathe, stand on my podium, patient engagement, patient engagement, patient engagement. It's what I do day in, day out. And understanding that patient engagement is defined as, and we've talked about it a little bit, intentional and meaningful interaction with patients. And I think, you know, in the world of academia, that's a little bit, you know, foo-foo, right? Intentional, meaningful interaction with patients. And ultimately, patient engagement, what I do in my role, you know, is there are benefits that we want to achieve that matter to patients. So we've talked about improved health, improved access to the healthcare system, the right treatment at the right time. I think both Heidi and Melanie touched on that. Being an active and informed patient in healthcare, you know, quality of life that's tied to patient, you know, oriented outcomes, and obviously making a contribution to improving like the cost effectiveness, right, of our healthcare system and the social healthcare system. So that's what I do day in, day out in my role with evaluation and research. And really, you know, my role sort of stemmed from the Canadian Institute of Health Research's strategy for patient-oriented research. And so that's kind of how I got into my role and my position. And the work that I do is predominantly around patient-oriented research. You know, and that was introduced 5 years ago here in BC. You know, but when it comes to clinical trials, it just hasn't been widely introduced or widely talked about. You know, and perhaps I even challenge, even understood what patient engagement or patient-oriented could look like, you know, in this sort of clinical trial setting. And so that's kind of why we're here today and why we're having this conversation. So like I said, it's not just that it hasn't been introduced. I'm just really curious of how it's understood.
I want to make a comment there. Patient engagement in clinical trials is crucial because otherwise people drop out. I was extraordinarily determined to stay in my clinical trial, but there were lots of things that were not patient oriented at all, and somebody else would have dropped out because of them. So if you want to get the patients that are appropriate for your trial and you want to actually keep the patients, you need to understand our perspective.
Absolutely, 110%, Heidi.
I could echo that too. I know that with our involvement in clinical trials, Stephen and I have probably gotten 15 or 20 people interested in volunteering and participating, and probably 6 of them now are actively participating in a clinical trial. I think that a successful clinical trial is kind of its own advertisement through the patient participants. So I remember walking into one, again, down at the Center for Brain Health, and the first question I was asked is, what do you need? Right. I mean, it was just almost a shock to hear that. What do you need? And you think about it, there's simple things like, how do you get from point A to B? How do you park? What time will it be? Will I have to drive in rush hour, or like Heidi drive for 22 hours through the snow to the site? How will I know what a reaction is? Who will I contact? And I find little details, I think, that are taken for granted sometimes by researchers, you know, the organization or the location. A couple of times I haven't had a clue who to call or what to call. So I think getting patients involved makes a safer trial. As Heidi has already mentioned, it helps people stay in the trial, but it also allows participants to talk about a successful trial in their community. And that's what we all do.
And on that front, you know, if anybody asked me if they should do a clinical trial with the drug company that I did mine with, I would say no.
Good.
Don't. And that's terrible advertising.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, I just can't help but wonder, you know, Srin, you're a researcher, you do clinical trials, you hear two patients who've had some, I guess, poor experiences working in a clinical trial. How does that make you feel? What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, it's incredibly powerful feedback as a researcher to think about, as like remembering, like, yes, I look at numbers and which patient was allocated to which group and looking at outcomes and spreadsheets and charts and things. But behind each of those numbers and each of those charts is individuals, and individuals who have interests and wants and want to be participating in this process of research, and how we can sort of boil down the complex clinical trial and make sure that the patient experience is as best as it could be, but also like keeping in mind that like experience and satisfaction is important. Engagement is probably more so. Like making sure they feel involved in it and making sure they feel like they're thinking about what they're doing and why they're doing it. Like we could just give more money to patients and their satisfaction levels would probably go up in a way. But I wouldn't say that that's necessarily what we're aiming for here. We're aiming for patients to be engaged in the process and just to think about the type of research that they're doing in a collaborative way.
And understanding that patient satisfaction and patient experience are two very different things, exactly what you've just mentioned. So I think this is definitely an important conversation.
I think too, a successful patient or participant experience, I'm not sure what to call us, also helps build trust in the system. I mean, one of the problems, especially now, I think everybody has with drug companies and even with academic institutions, is they seem to be money-making enterprises. They don't seem to have much to do with the real lives of people who may have a condition or a disease or whatever it was called. And I think by showing that it's kind of patient-centered, it allows me to be active in the treatment of my own condition, which is what I'd like to be. And it also shows that behind that need to generate enough income to support, I guess, the healthcare system, the people involved actually care about the individuals in the healthcare system that eventually their research will treat. And that's probably an advertisement in and of itself.
I think it's so important. Right now we have a crisis of trust in science and experts. And if you are not open about the work that you are doing, that trust is going to deteriorate further, and we need to go the other direction. We need research to be open and accessible. And as we've said, we are your best advertisers. Like, I personally really believe in science, and I absolutely would do another clinical trial, just not with that company. But it distresses me to see the distrust in science. And we have to change that, and that's going to have to start with openness.
Great, thank you. I mean, to hear from some patient partners about their experiences, to hear from Srin and his research experience, and Bev and her work in research and evaluation, it makes me think that this is the idea of a crisis is really important here, and that's going to influence how clinical trials are done. So let's move to Allison. We haven't heard from Allison yet about this, and I'd like to know about how you're positioning patient engagement in the work you're doing at Clinical Trials BC.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, I mean, as you're talking, it is bringing me back to the question you first asked, Larry. How did you get into sort of patient engagement in clinical trials and thinking about that and trying to support that, learn more about what that is? And I think it ties into work that I had done while I was a coordinator, working with an investigator like Suren, and responsible for the implementation and conduct of a clinical trial. And I did that for many, many years, and some studies went really well and others were a challenge. And I'm talking about really the operational side of it, because we weren't involved in the writing of the protocol most of the time. It was, here is the protocol, can you do this trial? Yes, okay, go ahead. And there's a feasibility assessment that is done when a site and an investigator decide whether or not to take on a trial. And this is primarily around industry trials, not those that the academic or clinician investigator is leading, but those that are led by industry. So you go through this feasibility process, which usually is focused on the protocol. You know, are we able to take the blood samples they require? Are we able to do this in the time that's allocated? Can we return the data in this timeline? Can we collect this kind of data in the way they're asking? Do we have the staff to meet those number of visits? So that's the feasibility, and it really focuses on that. But where I think the piece that's also missing, and that we realized we needed to do in order to ensure we could enroll for clinical trials, retain participants in clinical trials, was acceptability. So the trial might be feasible logistically, but is it going to be acceptable to those patients, the population that you're looking to enroll? And oftentimes we saw these studies, phase 1, that was fine, that's healthy volunteers and a certain select group. Phase 2, yeah, there might be, you know, it's smaller, it might have gone a little better, and it may have only been done in 1 or 2 countries. And when they get to phase 3, they roll that out to larger populations. Perhaps the protocol just stayed very much the same that it did in the earlier phases. And now they're looking at enrolling other populations like adolescents, preteens, over 65, different groups that have potentially different needs. And when we realized, you know, we had one clinical trial, we only enrolled 1 participant. And we looked at, you know, and we'd had other trials, maybe over 200 that we could enroll. And we recognize, and this is really with advocation from the advocates that we had at our site were our nurses. And it was really the clinical research nurses that said to us, you know, we need to ask the patients and the families before we take on these trials, what do they think about it? Would they participate in this trial? Is this too many visits? What about this informed consent form? Does it make sense? What about this assent for my 9-year-old? What are they going to think about it? So we started to do that actually as our practice. We didn't know that it was patient engagement because there wasn't such a term as that for us 10 years ago. And it really switched it from, is the trial feasible, to, is it going to be acceptable to the patient population and participants? Will we be able to enroll, meet our targets, and provide the data back to the sponsors that need it? So that's where I really got into this. And then probably about 5 years ago, I led a national survey to engage those that have participated in clinical trials or declined them about their experience, what their experience was like in clinical trials. That led me to meet with Melanie, later with Heidi, and a big key finding was around that lack of communication of results. But it really solidified my passion for improving the participation experience. And now, after learning through the SPORE initiatives, conversations with people like Bev and Larry and all of my colleagues out there, there's a whole other world that's, you know, we really have a lot of work to do.
Thanks, Allison. So Heidi and Melanie, I mean, this is going beyond just sort of feedback about how the trials are being operated. This is getting into much more, I guess, helping designing trials and helping the running of the trials. So do you have any comments about anything that Allison has just said?
I think I have one. I think it's so important to consider who your participants are, like who they will be, and invite them in right at the beginning and let them help or talk to them about what kind of needs they have, what their expectations are, what they hope will happen. Most people get involved, I think, for some personal reasons. I think they hope that what's discovered will help them. But I think much of it is altruism, that they want to help other people avoid whatever they've gone through. And certainly with children, that seems to be true. So I think by bringing people in early to help design it, to help, how do you communicate to somebody who's 60 who might be in the same trial as somebody who's 15? You're certainly going to have to change things a little bit. Even thinking about simple things like how are you going to break up the time? How are you going to arrange the site visits? How are you going to get people from point A to point B? All of those things are so important. And I think patient partners can contribute a lot to what would make me comfortable if I were in that, and what would make a variety of people comfortable and make the trial successful and, as Alison said, accessible.
And I think another thing that one of the problems that we see with clinical trials is a lack of diversity. And if you don't include patients from the demographic that you want to engage, I mean, in Canada, a big problem is engaging Indigenous people. I think it's really important that we do so. They have important medical needs that are going unmet, and they're not included in clinical trials in sufficient numbers. So having somebody who can help you explain what the barriers are can only help your trial.
You know,
Can I ask a question? Like, where does that responsibility lie? Does it lie at the researchers? Does it lie at the funders? Does it lie at the ethics boards? Or I don't know. Who makes the decisions about diversity, A? And B, who decides what's good and what's good enough in that respect? Because the way we do it now is sort of like, I'm a researcher, I decide, like, oh, okay, I'll want this, and I'm diverse now, done. But really, it's not necessarily the solution that like you're proposing, Heidi, which is like the true engagement in the process. But where does that policy move need to come from? I'm asking. That's Bev, actually, because she's the...
Well, I think Alison's probably can speak to this too, because that change is coming, right? So, you know, when it comes to patient-oriented research, I mean, I came to my job actually as a patient partner. So I've been a patient partner, an activated patient partner here in Canada for years. So for me to take this on as a role really wasn't that challenging. I always saw it as a moral imperative, right? Why aren't we being included in you know, patient-oriented research? That just makes sense to me. But in regards to policy, I think we have to move that gauge. I think it's leadership, absolutely. I think anytime we're wanting to change policy, you have to have leadership buy-in. I'm super fortunate in my department that my direct managers complete buy-in to patient engagement. So for me, it's a bit of an easier lift, but take that up to the health authority, take that up to provincial health authority, take that up to the national, like a federal level. I think there's a lot more that we can do. But so that's where the responsibility lies. But I think the responsibility lies in any of us who are doing research. So if you're a patient partner, you know, maybe build capacity, or we help build capacity so that patient partners can steward this conversation and push it forward. You know, we like to support, you know, researchers doing the same thing. So I think it's a collective push, personally, but you know, it's coming, and Alison's going to share what that looks like. So, you know, we all need to get a bit prepared for that.
I think
Absolutely.
too, if you switch it around and you look at what the outcome is that you want, look at it from that end rather than from Srin's kind of the running of the trial, but you look at the impact of the trial. Who do you want to treat? Who do you want to make the medication or the device available to? Who do you want it to work for? Kids, everybody, a particular population that where a condition is prevalent. And I think you want to try and engage that population right at the start. I know that most of my family is Indigenous, their status, and they're registered on various reserves. You know, they carry little red cards, bagged and tagged, you can call it. And it's very difficult for some of them, if they're on reserve, to access medical care at all. There's deep suspicion about the racism that's prevalent throughout Canadian society that sends up all kinds of barriers. And then there's off reserve people, like my husband and my family, that are well educated, lots of university degrees, lots of access to medical care. And we kind of work as a transition for some of the people. But it's very difficult. And I think communication and bringing people in early, bringing in for the Indigenous community, some of the elders, some of the healthcare people on the reserve, some of the people in the friendship centers that work with urban off-reserve Indigenous people would be helpful if you want to target that population. There's groups too in the Southeast Asian community that are in a similar boat. So I think bringing them in early and having a conversation about the outcome and then what's needed, how do you make this work? And working carefully with communication would build that trust and involvement. But flip it over and see what you want to achieve with your research.
It goes back to that idea that you're going to help someone, you want to help a certain population, you've got to make sure that they're involved, not just as participants in the research, but as partners in the development of the research. Yeah. And you know, Bev has pointed out that the times are a-changing, and the theme of this conference is modernization of clinical trials. So I'd like to circle back to Alison for a moment here and find out about what's coming up in modernization of clinical trials in BC, Canada, and where else?
Internationally. This is goes a little bit back to a conversation Bev and I have been having over the last few months around garnering support for operationalizing patient engagement in clinical trials. What that looks like, why should we be doing it, but how, and how can that be sustainable? And Bev, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. But one of the things that came up was the conversation we're having today is it's very clear why it's important to have patient engagement in clinical trials and in research. But Seren, you mentioned, well, who facilitates, who leads that is our policymakers, the researchers, the patients. And there is an international council for harmonization that sets guidances for how clinical trials should be done at an international level. I believe there's over 56 different regulatory bodies that follow these guidances or adopt them, review them, and adopt them. Certainly Health Canada generally adopts the guidances that are put out by this council. And one of the very first guidances they put out was called E8, which is General Considerations for Clinical Trials. It's almost the baseline, the general piece, and then there's numerous guidances that follow. Good clinical practice is one that people are familiar with. That's E6, now on revision 2 or R2. But E8 is the baseline, and it was first published in '97. And the first revision, or R1, is expected to be adopted in February of 2021. And that really is setting the stage for modernization. But I think one key part in there, and it says this a number of times if you're to read the draft guideline, it is available on the ICH website. It really it says that they recommend and that for the design, planning, and conduct of clinical trials, that all groups should be consulting with patients and or patient organizations during that process. And this will help ensure that all perspectives are captured. So it's coming in the international guidances for clinical trials, and that's at the regulatory level. It could be a year or 2 years before Health Canada actually adopts that as a regulatory policy, but it's definitely coming at that level. And I think
we. And I think too, Alison, like we see that in patient engagement in general, big P, big E patient engagement, like over the last decade, patient engagement, patient partnerships, have really grown, in particular the last 3 to 5 years.
Mhm.
And I know most people have probably heard the saying, nothing about us without us. Well, that battle cry is now becoming best practice across healthcare, whether it's service design, delivery, patient care, patient research. It's just becoming, Accreditation Canada as an example. Every standard that's being created includes patient partners in developing health standards for accreditation, right? And patient partners are surveyors, for HSO. So this idea of patient-centric care and patient engagement, thankfully, is becoming a core tenet of our healthcare system, right? So you wouldn't find a pamphlet with patient instructions, hopefully, without having a patient having put their eyes on it. I'm sure there's still lots out there. New hospitals and clinics are being designed with patients and families engaged in that design process. So to me, it's like, we've gone from done to done for to done with. So why wouldn't clinical trials be adapting this culture and operational change? It's not a matter of if this is coming, like it's here. Right. And there's you look at the Canadian Cancer Clinical Trials Stakeholder Charter. I mean, it just lays it out beautifully how to do this. So we're here today, we're here.
Yeah, we definitely are. And I think somebody might have mentioned it, but up until now, there was really, in the space of clinical trials, it was patient-centric clinical trials, right? Like, let's design the trial sort of around the patient. But I think this is definitely taking it that one step beyond, where you're engaging with the patients to design and conduct and involved in the outcomes of the trial. So it's starting to move beyond just that conversation of a patient-centric trial to patient-engaged trial.
Great, thank you. So I think we'd like to circle back to Srin now, because you asked the question about how does this happen, and now we see that there are new guidelines coming into play. Have you seen any evidence of this happening elsewhere? Do you see how this is going to play out here? Any comments about that?
Yeah, no, I asked that question mostly to trigger some of these conversations, because I think it's important that these policies are known and implemented. And like all GCP or like those sort of Council on Harmonization type policies, they're only as good as the people who put them into place. And you can sort of massage them enough that really they become sort of watered down, that they don't actually do the things that you want them to do, while adding bureaucracy at the same time. And so you can also run into problems by applying them and not do the things that they end up wanting you to do by applying them. And so really it behooves the researchers, I would argue, and the research sponsors and the ethics boards, basically the people who are actually doing the work, to think about what the work is to be done, and the funders, of course, too, because I think they're integral to this whole process, to be able to be accountable and provide those metrics of accountability as to what exactly you are doing with your activities and how you're engaging and what the engagement is and how meaningful it is. I know that like one of my SPORE funded grants does that, and it's very good at making sure I have metrics, and every 6 months I have to say how many patients I've engaged and how much my reach has been and so on. But that's only one not small, but one funder in Canada. Every other funder does not require that. And in the end, most research is done without that.
Great, thanks. So, we've heard from some patient partner experiences. We know that there's policy changing. We see that there's a desire to do this work. But I think the question that people are going to want to know is how, what ways can patients or members of the public provide input into clinical trials? So let's start off by asking the patient partners what they think, how they can best improve the conduct of clinical trials.
So I guess one thing is understanding the barriers. I think we mentioned this before, the barriers to actually getting people into the trials, like what, I being rural, so what are the barriers that I face? I mean, I had one huge debacle over medication once, and actually getting it, because I'm a rural participant, and, even things like not all couriers will actually come to my door. Some of the companies will come and some of them won't. That's something somebody in the city would never even occur to them. So we can help you determine what barriers your target population is going to face. I think Melanie mentioned before, we're your best recruiters too. Like if we have positive experiences and believe in this, I'm super happy to talk about it with anybody who's interested. Did you want to add, Melanie?
Well, I think there's a lot of, in the initial design even of the research question, by talking to people who suffer from whatever condition or have experienced whatever disease is being investigated, often can help refine what it is, what kind of outcome he might want in the research. Certainly not frame it for the researcher, but provide some input that might help the framing of the question. I think looking too at who the participants are likely to be and what their needs are. Heidi's mentioned barriers. There's also needs. For example, I keep thinking of one of my kids that I talked into joining a clinical trial on a medical device for birth control. And immediately the meetings started to be scheduled between 4 and 6. Now she had young children. So anybody who has young children knows that a meeting between 4 and 6 is just a nightmare for women or for men, or just moving around. There's all kinds of issues with young kids at the witching hours, I call it. And she and several other young women have dropped out from that trial simply because the burden was too great. So I think we can help make trials successful by really elaborating on what the barriers, what the timing, what the needs are. And I think, as Heidi said, we can help you recruit. Most of us are connected with large communities. We're connected with people who experience things similar to us who might be interested in joining. Most of us would be quite willing to help advertise a trial that we thought was well designed. So I think that there's a lot of ways that we can assist, and we can make sure that the communication, the language that's being used is clear for people. I've found that knowing what to expect and who to call if I'm confused or I'm having trouble is the key always once a trial is underway. And that piece is often the hardest to find. So.
Yeah.
Melanie mentioned kind of early in the design phase, even some of the outcome measures that you use, sometimes what is important to us as patients are not necessarily the things that you think are important. Now, there's clinical trials where that's not relevant. You know, for example, I have MS, and so obviously MRIs, you know, are going to be something that's really measurable. But lots of studies have many outcome measures that are, you know, we should have some input into them. I think we can. There's lots of amazing, intelligent patients who are super educated and thoughtful, who have these diseases that can help determine what the outcome measures would actually be useful to them.
Great, thank you both. I think I'd like to know now from Srin, just sort of, we've heard what patient partners feel they can offer to clinical trials. What would you look for? Can you give us an example of how it's worked or something you'd looked for your own work?
Like, I think Heidi's last point about what outcomes are important for patients. And I think it's obviously a fundamental thing to look for in a clinical trial is determining what your outcome is. And trial folks will often decide on an outcome based on feasibility and hitting sample sizes that they think are relevant and what they can do to make sure that it's statistically sound. And so when they finish it, they can say they have a positive study. But in the end, what we care about and what informs guidelines and what informs practice is, does a patient get better or not? And so very often we'll define our studies based on what we can do and not necessarily what we should do. And that's sort of the main lesson that I'm getting from engaging patients during the process, as you define studies and think about what's important. And yes, that takes time. And so it sort of speaks to having all of this work done like already. Like, what's important for patients? We can ask them now on the flu, for example, or knee pain, or any other question, developing the outcomes that are important for patients for each of those major problems. And then trials use those. And then they can say that it was informed by patients. And so it doesn't go through the whole prioritization process across a diverse panel during that startup phase.
Thanks, Ren. I think Allison was wanting to say something there. Were you, Allison?
I was just going to add to Heidi and Melanie's, but now I'm really processing everything Seren just said, because you kind of got at some systems level thinking there that's kind of cool, in that can we find ways to do this and then utilize what was built for additional trials. So, because again, the cost to clinical trials is huge, and the money that goes into setting them up. So are there ways we can do this that are really more effective than bit one by one sort of building that? So I'm thinking about that, and I'm distracted from my other comment, but I think what it was going back to something Heidi said, or Melanie, around the readability. So some people will say, well, how do I engage a patient partner in my clinical trial? Like, what can they do? And they want very concrete examples. And if it's somebody just starting for the first time and they've already started the protocol, perhaps, maybe the trial's underway, some easy sort of initial things they can do is ask patient partners to review the informed consent form and the information that's being given to participants to ensure that it's clear and understandable to them. In addition, the questionnaires that are being used, or the outcome, you mentioned outcome measures, sometimes it's the format of them. They may have preferred formats, whether it's an electronic or paper-based, whether it's a certain type of quality of life questionnaire that's used. So you can get input on those. And then in the end as well, the results, communication of study results back to participants. You can ask your patient partners what they think would be ideal. You can ask them to help develop the communications themselves. So those types of things are some very good concrete things that somebody can do if they want to just start and they don't have the ability to do this right from the beginning with the priority setting.
That really, I think that the next question has to be to Bev then. How do you actually do this work? Bev, you have experience doing this in Fraser, so can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, because I think, the big question is how, and everybody's probably wondering how, but I think going back to the very beginning of our conversation is, when we're talking about patient engagement clinical trials, that conversation, isn't very common, and maybe, again, it's not understood. But, the framework for operationalizing patient engagement already exists. We're already doing it for patient-oriented research. So my role as an example, right? I work within a Department of Evaluation and Research Services. I support all members in my team, whether they're with research, ethics, whether they're with the evaluation team, whoever they are, I support all of them in patient engagement, along with clinicians and healthcare decision makers and patients and families and organizations. Clinical trials is in our portfolio. And when you look at patient engagement and how to operationalize it, there's kind of like three core areas of engagement. There's like the patient engagement in governance and decision-making, capacity building for patient engagement, and then this idea of tools and resources. So the example in governance. So, we're just helping set up with our long-term care researchers, in our health authority, as we're setting up a resident and care partners interested in research. And that group is going to help inform research specific to long-term care researchers in that region, right? So, when our big sort of pandemic happened and patients and families were really elbowed out of the way, we don't want to make that mistake again. So the thought and the sort of excuse was we don't have time. So my role and what I provide, in operationalizing this, is I provide a service. I'm in essence a consultant to researchers in our area, including clinical trials, so I can help them develop, some of these relationships. I can help build capacity for patient engagement. We have tools and resources, whether it's a budget template, whether it's, here's some plain language summary guides, things like that. And even when we're talking about diverse community and the hardly reached, we've developed a trauma-informed practice guideline for researchers, so there is no harm, or we're mitigating harm. So it already exists. We've already operationalized, this idea of patient engagement in clinical trials. And this, of course, in the long run, will then lend to us supporting the front end of clinical trials with recruitment and retention, again, plain language, again, consent. So we already have this framework. It's just, having that culture shift and having people sort of stretch their knowledge that within our department, clinical trials is just another component of what we can support, patient engagement with. And obviously supporting families and patients is our biggest part of it. The question remains for me at the end of all this is what is that business model, I guess? So is it within my department? Do we provide that? Is it a non-government org like they have in the States? There's an organization set up there as a non-government org. Is it a for-profit consulting company that somebody puts together? Is it fee-based? So there's some questions around those sort of ideas that I don't think we've quite got there yet, but of course that'll take a lot more conversations. But I think that the trick here is to lean into those who are doing it, lean into those who are starting to do it well, and lean into, patient partners who are passionate about their disease process and their conditions and their experience, because that really is what's going to lend to success at the end of the day.
Well, thanks very much, Bev. And we only have a few minutes left, and I'd like to just go around then. We'll go with Allison and Srin and end off with our patient partners since we began with them. So Allison, do you have anything else that you wanted to add to this to sort of close us off for this discussion today?
No, I think the one thing that I didn't touch on, and Heidi did, around the diversity. I attended a session the other week. It was from the US, and they were talking about increasing diversity in clinical trial participation, right? And then the conversation led to, well, in order to do that, we need to increase the diversity in our patient partners that we engage in the clinical trials. So that was really key. And then it finally led to the conversation, it's only by doing that, those diverse patient partners will be able to help inform you beyond the barriers. What are the cultural sensitivities you need? What is the understanding that you, the researcher, need that you don't have when you necessarily wrote the protocol, designed the trial, wrote the materials? There could be in your study populations different cultural awareness that might be needed that patient partners, if they are diverse, could bring and help you sort of improve. Therefore, it is reducing barriers and ultimately hopefully increasing the diversity of your participant population. So it was a very interesting session, and the person that was speaking used to be a clinical trial coordinator and then recognized that he was always having these conversations telling people, like, this is how my family works and this is what we do, and this is, you're never going to be able to do a clinical trial with our community unless, this, and this. And we choose to participate as a family and as a community, and we need to have trust, and just all of these different conversations that happen as a result. And so they kind of moved from being a research coordinator into this other space of advising researchers. So I think that's another role that patient partners can play that's really important. And I see it in something they're calling workforce innovation in clinical trials. So in the clinical trial workforce itself, how do we increase the diversity there? Because by doing that, that's going to help increase diversity, hopefully, overall.
Thank you. I think diversity could be another hour-and-a-half discussion. Srin, what was your words of wisdom for this last minute?
I guess to my fellow researchers who are watching this, and I appreciate the challenges with making sure you're doing it right at the level of patient engagement. They are without a doubt challenges. But in the end, when you think about your research actually driving care and practice, that little bit of extra effort put in at the very beginning will extend out significantly, exponentially, you could say, in the end. And so it's a bit of pain in front, not pain, but it's a bit of effort, but the gains are substantial. And so I want to remind everyone about that, because there is a sentiment that, oh, it's a lot of work. Do I have to do this? Do I have to do this? And I think both from a moral imperative, but also from a actual practical imperative of getting good research done and informing care and making patients better, I think both of those reasons say yes.
Well, that's great. It's an upstream investment for downstream benefits. So Heidi, what about you? Last words of wisdom?
I think that sometimes as the patient, I do cause some of the committees I'm on some pain in some respects, but you also need to recognize we really want you to be successful. Like, as patients here, we're not here to make your life more difficult. We want good research outcomes. We want success. We want the results of these trials to get into practice. And so while we may challenge you, we really are on your side.
That's great, Heidi. I really like that. And then the onus is on the researcher to support the patient partners so that they can make give meaningful feedback. So Melanie, you're in the great position. You get to say the last little bit before we finish off. What would you like to say?
I think what I would say is connect with us. Just like you want to connect the research to clinical practice, connect with the patient, connect with the participant right at the beginning, and make that possible, rather than see it as some distant goal. We're right there at the beginning. And as Heidi said, we want medical care to get better. And that includes more support for research. Anybody who's a patient knows that. Right?
Wonderful. Thank you. That's a great way to end off this discussion. I think, Allison, you have a few words to say before we finish off for today.
Thank you, Larry. I really want to thank all of you on this panel for having this chat with as a group today, and all of your work and input into formulating the session. And I thank you, Larry, for being our wonderful facilitator. It was really helpful for guiding us and taking us on that journey, so thank you. For anybody that may be joining us as part of the conference, there should be some downloadable handouts that you can see in this session, and we invite you to continue this conversation with us. We're looking at holding a series of sessions through a developing community of practice. Many on this panel will be joining us for that, so please look for information on how we can continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.